What do prison labor, ICE detention, and centuries of women's domestic servitude have in common? They're all forms of slavery. I believe millions of Americans failed to read the 13th Amendment in its entirety. So let's start there, shall we? Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. That's the amendment to the U.S. Constitution that supposedly ended slavery. But then there's that pesky exception clause, right? It provided a legal loophole so massive that it redefined what emancipation even meant. Today, that loophole is alive and well, not just in prisons, but in immigration detention centers, where people are being detained unlawfully, exploited for their labor, and subjected to dehumanization under the authority of ICE. This isn't new. In fact, it's a very, very old playbook. Why reinvent the wheel, right? All that the white supremacists who are in charge of our federal government needed to do was set it in motion. After the Civil War, the South had a labor crisis. Its economy was built on slavery. And now that slavery was illegal, technically, but not entirely, that exception clause in that 13th Amendment made room for what would become known as the prison industrial complex. Southern states began criminalizing Black life through the Black Codes. These were laws that tried to control the hundreds of thousands of formerly enslaved Americans. Virginia passed a law in 1866 that claimed to target, quote, dissolute and abandoned characters, end quote. But what it really did was criminalize poverty. Under this law, anyone who was homeless or unemployed could be sentenced to forced labor for up to 3 months. They would be put to work on public projects or for private businesses for little to no wages. If they tried to escape and were caught, they'd finish out their sentence in chains, and they were given only the bare minimum amount of food needed to survive. Of course, the real target wasn't the vagabonds. It was newly freed Black people, many of whom were traveling the country in search of family members that they had been separated from due to slavery. This law functionally outlawed freedom of movement, self-determination, and any attempt to build a new life. General Alfred H. Terry, who was stationed in Virginia at the time, saw through this bullshit right away and called it precisely what it was: slavery in all but name. He banned its enforcement, but this law stayed on the books until 1904. And Virginia wasn't alone. Southern states across the board began passing similar laws, ones that turned the attempt to survive into a crime: being poor, being unemployed, standing still for too long. These so-called crimes were used to flood the jails with Black men and women who were then leased out to plantations, mines, and railroads. This was not a fluke. This was the plan. Slavery had been abolished in name, but not in practice. Convict leasing took its place, and the violence, the exploitation, and the unpaid labor never missed a beat. Fast forward to present day. ICE detention centers have become the new plantations. Migrants and asylum seekers, most of whom have not committed any crime at all, are being detained indefinitely. Inside these facilities, they are forced to work for little to no pay. Some receive $1 a day. Some receive nothing at all. These people have had their lives criminalized, not because of what they've done, but because of who they are and where they come from, just like Black Americans during Reconstruction. Immigrants are being recast as criminals in order to justify their captivity. In her book, The Creation of Patriarchy, Gerda Lerner outlines 3 elements of economic organization that are required in order to have slavery. Number 1, you have to have a surplus of food and resources. Number 2, you have to have a method for capturing and detaining prisoners. And number 3, you have to have a clear distinction between the enslaved and the enslavers. Let's apply this to ICE. Number 1, the U.S. clearly has a surplus of food, of resources, of housing, abundant yet inaccessible to most people. Number 2, ICE exists entirely to capture and detain immigrants. Number 3, there is a clear distinction between citizen and non-citizen, native and foreigner, white and other. This creates the conditions for slavery, but that's not all. Lerner also outlines 3 features necessary to sustain enslavement. And those are the following. Number one, it must be seen as an alternative to a violent death or a commutation of a death sentence. These detainees are told that being in a camp, well, that's better than being deported to a dangerous homeland or another country entirely. Secondly, the U.S. must impose natal alienation on the population they hope to enslave. They must be cut off from their social networks. Immigrants are often held far from their family. They're separated from their children. The children are separated if they are detained. Religious and cultural traditions are suppressed. Communication is restricted. Access to counsel is restricted. This is natal alienation. And finally, number three, they must be dishonored. The immigrant is painted as dangerous, illegal, a threat. The stereotype is that they're criminal, dirty, diseased, unworthy. And it's that dishonor that justifies their exploitation. The thing is, these same methods have been used against women throughout history. You don't have to put a person in chains to enslave them. Criminalization, making a person a social outlaw, is just as powerful a tool of enslavement as anything. In Caliban and the Witch, Silvia Federici argues that the rise of capitalism wasn't just about factories and machines. It was about violence, land theft, and most importantly, it was a war against women. To create capitalism, entire communities had to be broken. At the heart of these communities were the women who held power as midwives, herbalists, sexual rebels, and community leaders. And they used the witch hunts to break these women, to destroy these communities. The witch hunts were calculated campaigns of terror. Women were criminalized for being poor, for being rich, for practicing traditional medicine, for living alone, or even just for being too outspoken. And when the state branded these women witches, it created a pretext to strip them of dignity, connection, and safety. Any of this sounding familiar? Federici expands Karl Marx's concept of primitive accumulation, the violent stealing of land and labor needed for capitalism, and adds something crucial: the destruction of women's reproductive power and community-based economies. Just as slaves were ripped from their families and cultures, women were stripped of land, stripped of midwifery knowledge, and cast out of paid labor, and their bodies became battlegrounds for control. You see, capitalism could not exist without first controlling the labor that creates the labor. In other words, women's unpaid domestic, emotional, and most importantly, reproductive labor. And this is where the connection to what's going on today becomes undeniable. What we're seeing with ICE detention centers, where immigrants are stripped from their families, held without trial, denied wages for their work, or made to work for $1 a day. This is not a new development. It's history. It's just the repeat of an old pattern. Just like the witch hunts turned independent women into criminals, the U.S. government now turns undocumented migrants into criminals through the mere act of crossing a border. And just like the post-Civil War South invented vagrancy and loitering to legally re-enslave Black people, the immigration system invents crimes like unlawful presence, fraudulent entry to legally extract labor from brown bodies. Criminalization is a prerequisite for exploitation. You must first make someone dishonored, dangerous, or unworthy. Then you can lock them up, steal their labor, and strip them of their rights. And society will just look the other way. Well, they broke the law, so they deserve what's happening to them. So when we talk about the prison industrial complex, or ICE, or the recriminalization of abortion and reproductive health care, we are talking about primitive accumulation. And that's why Caliban and the Witch is still such an important book. It helps us see the gendered, racialized blueprint of capitalism, not as progress, but as organized theft, a theft that's still happening today. Women under patriarchy have been treated as domestic slaves for centuries. They cooked, cleaned, cared for children, and had no ownership over their own bodies, their labor, or their time for thousands of years. Gerda Lerner's framework for slavery also applies to them. They were dependent on men for food and for resources, an alternative to death by starving or lack of shelter. Remember the rules? Marriage and war were mechanisms for capture, natal alienation. Prisoners of war were taken far away from their lands and whatever was left of their people. And in marriage, women had to leave their family and surrender their names and their legal personhood. And gender created the enslaved-enslaver divide, dishonor through the gendered division of labor, and forced subjugation to men. And like modern day detainees, they were socially alienated, kept from each other and from community, dishonored, seen as irrational, emotional, even sinful, less human than men, somehow. We saw this as recently as the post-World War II era. The embracing of suburban life had one effect that we don't often talk about: the isolation of women. It's easier to ensure safety and maintain community in more densely populated areas. If you need help, you share a very thin wall with your neighbor. One shout can bring you help in a matter of seconds. But it's harder to hear a woman scream when she's being beaten by her husband, when she's under a steep pitched roof on the second floor of a Cape Cod-style house in Levittown, with your nearest neighbor more than 60 feet away. Women's labor was expected, unpaid, and unrecognized. Like immigrants in detention, like re-enslaved Black Americans. In The Great Gatsby, when Nick warns Jay that you can't repeat the past, Jay responds, "Why, of course you can." And while Jay was wrong about his ability to rekindle his grand romance with the love of his life, it would be a mistake to assume the same of ICE. Slavery wasn't abolished. It was rebranded, first through Reconstruction-era laws, then through mass incarceration, and now through immigrant detention. Conservatives in red states are arresting women who have had miscarriages for the improper disposal of fetal tissue. There's talk of getting rid of no-fault divorce, panic over falling birth rates, and the commander-in-chief is a rapist. You can't repeat the past? Of course you can, old sport. Of course you can.